When my stepson saw me in that red miniskirt, I thought the moment would pass without consequence. But I was wrong. What started as an innocent encounter spiraled into a chain of events that would change everything. My marriage, my family, and even the way I saw myself. What happens when the truth you've been running from catches up with you? And how do you say goodbye to the one person who made you feel alive again? Stay with me as I unravel the story of a choice that forever altered the course of my life. The morning started like any other, mundane, yet tinged with the subtle loneliness that had become my norm. My husband, Greg, had left early for yet another business trip, his kisses on my cheek growing more perfunctory with each passing month. Our marriage had become more like a well-oiled machine than a partnership, efficient but devoid of warmth. I had hoped that Greg's son Ethan staying with us for the summer might bring some life back into our quiet home. Ethan was 22, home from college and still figuring out his next steps. His youthful energy should have been refreshing, but instead it created an unsettling tension I couldn't quite place. That day, I was tidying up the house, dressed casually in a comfortable tank top and shorts. The heat outside had prompted me to open the windows, letting a breeze filter through. As I sorted through some old clothes in my closet, I found it, the miniskirt. Bright red, slightly daring, and a relic from a time when I felt confident and alive. I couldn't remember the last time I'd worn it. Why not? I thought to myself. It's just me and Ethan here anyway. I slipped into it and paired it with a simple top, chuckling at the sight of myself in the mirror. It felt good to indulge in a piece of the woman I used to be, even if it was just for fun. Ethan's voice startled me as I walked into the living room. "Wow, you look different." I froze for a moment before turning to face him. He was seated on the couch, a book in his hands, but his eyes were fixed on me. "Different good or different bad?" I teased, trying to diffuse the sudden awkwardness. He cleared his throat, looking slightly flustered. "Good. You look really good, actually." The compliment lingered in the air longer than it should have. I laughed nervously, brushing it off as I grabbed a few magazines from the coffee table. But as I turned to walk back to the hallway, I felt his eyes on me, burning like a heat I hadn't expected. That evening, the tension grew. Ethan had made dinner, a rare gesture that surprised me. "It's just spaghetti," he shrugged. But the effort felt strangely intimate. We talked about his plans for the future, his frustrations with his dad, and his memories of summers spent in our house. His charm was undeniable, and for the first time, I noticed how much he had grown into himself. Confident, funny, and mature in a way I hadn't seen before. As we cleared the table, his hand accidentally brushed against mine. The contact was fleeting, but sent an unspoken energy coursing through me. I glanced up at him, and for a split second, his expression mirrored my own unease. As the evening unfolded, I tried to shake the unease that had settled between Ethan and me. After dinner, he suggested we watch a movie together. It was harmless enough, a way to fill the silence of the house. I agreed, grabbing a bottle of wine from the kitchen and pouring myself a glass. He opted for a beer. We settled onto the couch, a safe distance apart. Ethan scrolled through options until he landed on a classic thriller. It wasn't my favorite genre, but I didn't protest. I needed the distraction. As the movie played, I found myself more aware of him than the plot. His laughter at the witty dialogue, the subtle way his jaw tightened during tense scenes. These small details drew my attention in a way I couldn't explain. I scolded myself internally, blaming the wine for my wandering thoughts. And then it happened, hitting the door to the hallway. A jump scare made me flinch, and my glass tipped slightly, spilling wine onto my skirt. "Oh, great," I muttered, grabbing a napkin from the coffee table to dab at the stain. "Let me help," Ethan offered, leaning closer. His hand brushed mine as he took the napkin, and my breath hitched. For a moment our eyes met, and the world seemed to still. "It's fine," I said quickly, pulling away and standing up. "I should go change." "Don't," he said, almost too softly. The word hung in the air, and when I looked back at him, his gaze was unreadable. "You look really beautiful tonight." The sincerity in his voice stunned me. I opened my mouth to respond, but found myself at a loss. Instead, I hurried out of the room, my heart racing. In the sanctuary of my bedroom, I leaned against the door, struggling to catch my breath. What was happening? I had always seen Ethan as Greg's son, my stepson, a part of our family, but never anything more. Yet the way he looked at me tonight felt different, as though he didn't see me as just his stepmother anymore. I changed into a simple pair of lounge pants and a t-shirt, hoping the casual outfit would strip away whatever tension had crept into the evening. When I returned to the living room, Ethan was still on the couch, his posture more relaxed, but his eyes following me as I sat down. "I hope I didn't make you uncomfortable," he said, breaking the silence. I've noticed you seem different lately, like happier. It suits you." The honesty in his tone caught me off guard. "Thank you," I said softly, unsure of what else to say. "But, Ethan, we have to be careful about how things come across." His expression shifted, a mixture of frustration and longing flashing across his face. "I know, it's just, I feel like I can actually talk to you. You listen. You're real in a way most people aren't." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. "That means a lot, but what?" he interrupted. His voice was gentle but firm. "You don't feel it too?" I froze. The question hung in the air, daring me to confront the truth I didn't want to admit. Of course I felt it. The pull between us. The way his presence awakened something in me that had been dormant for years. But I couldn't say that. "Ethan," I began, my voice trembling, "this is complicated. You're Greg's son. We're family." His jaw tightened, and he looked away. "I know," he said finally. I'll stop. I don't want to make you uncomfortable." The vulnerability in his voice tugged at my heart. "I'm not uncomfortable," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "I'm just confused." The days that followed were a blur of avoidance. I kept myself busy, finding excuses to stay out of the house or to retreat to my room. Ethan, for his part, gave me space, but I could feel his presence lingering in every room, every unspoken moment between us. It all came to a head one evening when I found myself alone in the kitchen. I was washing dishes when Ethan walked in, his expression determined. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there watching me. "Is everything okay?" I asked, breaking the silence. "No," he said, his voice steady. "I can't stop thinking about you, and I know it's wrong, but I can't help it." My hands stilled in the soapy water. I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ethan, this isn't fair. To me, to your dad, to you." "I know," he said, stepping closer, "but it doesn't change how I feel." His words sent a jolt through me, and before I could think, he reached out, his hand brushing against my cheek. The touch was electric, a spark that ignited everything I'd been trying to suppress. I stepped back, shaking my head. We can't do this. But even as I said the words, I felt the pull, the undeniable chemistry between us. Ethan didn't move, his gaze locked onto mine. "Tell me you don't feel it too," he said softly, his voice a challenge and a plea all at once. I couldn't answer. The truth was too dangerous, too complicated. But in that moment, I realized the line between us had already blurred, and there was no going back. The tension between Ethan and me was a constant undercurrent now, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. Days turned into a routine of careful avoidance, stolen glances, short conversations, and a thick air of unsaid things that weighed heavily on my chest. But everything came to a head one afternoon. It was an unusually hot day, and the house was sweltering. Greg had been gone for over a week, and though he called every evening, our conversations were brief and obligatory. As the heat settled in, I decided to change into something lighter. I pulled on a flowy sundress, its thin straps and loose fabric a welcome reprieve from the oppressive warmth. I tied my hair up into a messy bun and went about cleaning the house. Ethan was out, and the silence in the house was a relief. I could finally breathe without worrying about navigating the complicated emotions brewing between us. I busied myself wiping down counters and folding laundry, hoping the physical work would clear my mind. But then I heard the door open. "Hey, I'm back," Ethan called from the entryway. I froze, a strange mix of anticipation and dread washing over me. "Hey," I called back, trying to sound casual. "How was your day?" "Good," he said, stepping into the kitchen. He held up a bag of groceries. I grabbed some stuff for dinner, thought I'd cook again. The sight of him was disarming. He wore a simple t-shirt and jeans, his hair slightly damp from the heat outside. There was an easy confidence about him, a charm that made it hard to remember he was my stepson and not someone else entirely. "That's thoughtful," I said, my voice strained. "But you don't have to keep doing that." "I don't mind," he replied, setting the bag on the counter. His eyes lingered on me for a moment, and I felt the weight of his gaze. "You look nice." I glanced down at my dress, suddenly self-conscious. "It's just too hot for anything else," I said, brushing off the compliment. I looked around at the other woman. He nodded, but the way he looked at me sent a shiver down my spine. "You deserve to feel good," he said softly, his voice carrying a depth that unnerved me. I turned back to the counter, pretending to busy myself with the dishes. "I'll get out of your way so you can cook," I said quickly, but before I could leave the kitchen, Ethan's hand gently touched my arm. "Wait," he said, his voice low. I froze, the warmth of his touch sending a ripple of emotion through me. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, my mind racing. "Ethan, I don't think that's a good idea." "Please," he said, stepping closer. "I need to say this." I turned to face him, my heart pounding. The look in his eyes was raw, vulnerable. "This thing between us," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I know it's not supposed to happen. I know it's wrong. But I can't stop thinking about you. You're all I think about." "Ethan," I started, but my voice faltered. His words cut through my defenses, hitting the parts of me I'd tried so hard to bury. The loneliness, the yearning, the need to feel seen. All of it bubbled to the surface. "You can't tell me you don't feel it too," he said, his tone desperate. "Because I see the way you look at me. I know you feel it." My breath hitched, and for a moment I couldn't find the strength to deny it. Because he was right. I did feel it. Every look, every touch, every moment we shared was charged with something I couldn't explain, something I couldn't ignore. It doesn't matter how I feel, I said finally, my voice barely a whisper. It can't happen. Why not? He asked, his frustration bleeding through. Because of my dad? He doesn't even see you the way you deserve to be seen. He's gone half the time, and when he's here, he barely pays attention to you. His words stung because they were true, but that didn't make them any less dangerous. Ethan, stop, I said, stepping back. This isn't about Greg. This is about doing the right thing. He stepped closer, closing the distance between us. And what if this is the right thing? He asked, his voice softening. What if we're supposed to feel this way? I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. You don't know what you're saying. Yes, I do, he said, his voice steady. I know exactly what I'm saying. And I think you do too. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, and for a moment, everything else faded away. It was just the two of us, standing in the kitchen, caught in a moment we couldn't undo. And then, before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us. It was a fleeting, reckless act, a kiss that lasted only a heartbeat, but changed everything. I pulled away almost immediately, my heart racing. I'm sorry, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I can't. Ethan reached for me, his touch gentle. Don't apologize, he said, his voice filled with emotion. Don't pretend you didn't feel that. I shook my head, stepping back. This was a mistake. We can't do this. Why not? He asked, his voice breaking. Because you're scared? Because it's easier to pretend you don't feel the same way? His words hit me like a blow, and I turned away, unable to face him. I need you to leave, I said, my voice trembling. Please, Ethan, just go. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, with a resigned sigh, he stepped back. Okay, he said quietly, but this isn't over. I didn't respond as he left the kitchen, the sound of his footsteps echoing down the hall. When the front door closed behind him, I sank to the floor. My body racked with sobs. That night, I lay awake, replaying the moment over and over in my mind. The kiss, the words, the emotions. It was all too much. I hated myself for letting it happen, for crossing a line I could never uncross. But deep down, I knew the truth. Ethan was right. This wasn't over. The days after the kiss were a whirlwind of avoidance and confusion. Ethan and I danced around each other, careful to keep our interactions short and impersonal. But the air between us was heavy with unspoken words and unresolved feelings. I tried to focus on my routines, pouring myself into housework and errands, but no matter how much I busied myself, I couldn't escape the memory of that moment, the way his lips felt against mine, the emotion in his voice, the way my heart had raced like it hadn't in years. It was a quiet evening when the tension finally boiled over. I was sitting in the living room, flipping mindlessly through a magazine when Ethan walked in. He hesitated in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Can we talk? He asked, his voice steady but soft. I didn't look up. I don't think that's a good idea. Please, he said, stepping closer. We can't keep pretending this didn't happen. I sighed, setting the magazine down. What do you want me to say, Ethan? That I made a mistake? That I regret it? Because I do. Do you? He challenged, his eyes locking onto mine. Because it didn't feel like a mistake. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I looked away, unable to face the intensity of his gaze. It doesn't matter how it felt. It was wrong. He sat down across from me, leaning forward. It only feels wrong because we've been told it's wrong. But what if it's not? What if this is exactly where we're supposed to be? I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. Ethan, stop. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, he interrupted. I understand that you're lonely, that you deserve more than what my dad gives you. And I understand that you felt something that night, just like I did. The truth in his words made my chest ache. This isn't about what I deserve, I said, my voice trembling. This is about doing the right thing. And what if the right thing is letting ourselves feel this? He asked, his voice filled with desperation. What if the right thing is choosing happiness for once? I stared at him, torn between the part of me that knew he was right and the part of me that was too scared to admit it. Ethan, we can't. It's not just about us. What about Greg? What about your dad? He leaned back, frustration flashing across his face. My dad doesn't even care. He's never here. He doesn't see you, doesn't appreciate you. He wouldn't even notice if you were gone. That's not fair, I said, my voice rising. He's your father, Ethan. And he's your husband, he shot back. But does he treat you like one? Does he make you feel loved or wanted or even seen? His words cut deep because they were true. Greg and I had grown distant over the years, our relationship more about convenience than love. But that didn't justify what had happened between Ethan and me. It didn't make it right. I can't do this, I said finally, standing up. I won't. Ethan stood too, his expression softening. I'm not asking you to do anything you don't want to do. I'm just asking you to be honest with yourself. With me. I turned away, unable to face him. Please just go, I whispered. He hesitated for a moment before sighing. Okay, but this isn't over, he said, echoing the words he'd spoken before. You know it isn't. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as Ethan's words replayed in my mind. He was right. No matter how much I tried to deny it, this wasn't over. There was something between us that couldn't be ignored, something that refused to go away, and it terrified me. The next morning, I woke early, determined to create distance between us. I decided to spend the day out, running errands and visiting friends, anything to avoid being alone with Ethan. But when I returned home that evening, I found him waiting for me in the kitchen. He was leaning against the counter, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. We need to talk, he said, his voice steady. I sighed, setting my bag down. Ethan, I've told you. I'm leaving, he said, cutting me off. I froze, his words catching me off guard. What? I'm leaving, he repeated. I think it's for the best. My heart clenched at the thought. Ethan, you don't have to. Yes, I do, he said, his voice firm. Because if I stay, I'll just keep hoping for something that can't happen. And it's not fair to either of us. Tears filled my eyes as the weight of his words sank in. Where will you go? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Back to school, he said. I'll stay with a friend until the semester starts. It's not a big deal. But it was a big deal. The thought of him leaving, of losing him, was almost too much to bear. Ethan, He stepped closer, his eyes filled with emotion. I'm not doing this to hurt you, he said softly. I'm doing this because I care about you, because I want what's best for you. A tear slipped down my cheek, and he reached out to wipe it away. His touch was gentle, his fingers lingering on my skin. "You deserve to be happy," he said, his voice breaking. "Even if it's not with me." I closed my eyes, unable to hold back the tears. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, "for everything." And then, before I could say anything else, he leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to my forehead. It was a goodbye, a final moment of connection before everything changed. When he pulled away, he gave me a small, sad smile. "Take care of yourself," he said before turning and walking out the door. I stood there, frozen, as the sound of his footsteps faded. And then, as the reality of his departure sank in, I broke down, sobbing into my hands. That night, the house felt emptier than ever. Ethan was gone, and with him the spark of life that had kept me going these past few weeks. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same. The days after Ethan left were an agonizing blur. The house, once alive with his presence, now felt hollow. Every corner held a memory. The kitchen where we'd shared lingering glances, the couch where our knees had brushed during movie nights, the hallway where I'd brushed past him one too many times to count. Greg returned from his business trip a few days later, oblivious to the storm that had passed in his absence. He greeted me with his usual detached warmth, kissing my cheek before burying himself in work emails. It was as though nothing had changed, for him at least. But for me, everything had. I found myself sinking into a routine, using the monotony of daily life as a shield against the emotions threatening to overwhelm me. But no matter how hard I tried to move on, Ethan's words lingered in my mind. "You deserve to be happy." Did I? The question haunted me, forcing me to confront truths I had long buried. My marriage with Greg had been on autopilot for years. We were partners in name, but the love and connection that had once defined us had faded into a distant memory. A week after Ethan's departure, I found myself in the spare bedroom he had stayed in, folding linens and organizing the space. It was a task I'd avoided, knowing the room would be filled with reminders of him. But as I worked, I found something I hadn't expected. A letter, folded neatly and placed on the bedside table. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakably Ethan's, each word carefully written, as though he'd poured his heart into the page. "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I needed to write it anyway. There are so many things I want to say, but words never seem to be enough. So here it is, plain and simple. I care about you more than I should, more than I'm allowed to. Leaving was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I know it's what had to happen. Staying would have only made things harder for both of us. You're tied to my dad, to this life, and I don't want to be the one who tears it apart. But I need you to know this. You're worth so much more than what you've been given. You deserve to feel loved, truly loved. You deserve to be seen, to be cherished. And if nothing else, I hope this letter reminds you of that. Take care of yourself. Be happy. You deserve it." The tears came before I could stop them, each word cutting deeper than the last. I clutched the letter to my chest, feeling a strange mix of pain and gratitude. Ethan had left, but he hadn't taken everything with him. He'd left me with a truth I couldn't ignore, one I had to face. Greg noticed the change in me before long. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening over dinner, his tone more curious than concerned. "I've just been thinking," I replied, keeping my eyes on my plate. "About what?" he pressed, his brow furrowing slightly. "Beldas, about this." I gestured vaguely to the space between us, to the house, to everything we'd built together. "Do you think we're happy, Greg?" He seemed taken aback by the question. "Of course we are," he said after a moment, though his tone lacked conviction. "Why wouldn't we be?" "Because it doesn't feel like it," I said, my voice trembling. "It feels like we've been coasting, going through the motions. Like we're more like roommates than a couple." Greg set his fork down, his expression shifting to something closer to concern. "Where is this coming from?" "It's been building for a long time," I admitted, "and I think we both know it. We've just been too afraid to say it." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of years of unspoken truths. Greg finally sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're right," he said quietly. "I guess I thought it was just part of being married for so long. Things settle, you know." "But should they?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Should we settle for this?" He didn't have an answer, and maybe that was the answer in itself. In the weeks that followed, Greg and I began to have the conversations we should have had years ago. We acknowledged the cracks in our marriage, the ways we had both let it slip into complacency. It wasn't easy and it wasn't pretty, but it was necessary. I also began to confront my own truths. Ethan's departure had forced me to look at myself in a way I hadn't in years. I realized that I had spent so much time trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect stepmother, that I had lost sight of who I was, of what I wanted. Greg and I decided to separate, not out of anger or bitterness, but out of a mutual understanding that we had grown apart. It was painful, but it was also freeing. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. Her sister handled it better than me, I thought. As for Ethan, I didn't hear from him again. He had made his choice to leave, and I respected it, but his words stayed with me, a quiet reminder of the lesson he had taught me. You deserve to be happy. It wasn't just a declaration. It was a challenge, one I was finally ready to accept. It was a week after Ethan left, and the house had settled back into its routine of emptiness. Greg was home, but predictably distant, buried in his work. I was tidying up the living room when I noticed something sticking out from beneath the couch cushions. A folded piece of paper. Curiosity piqued, I pulled it out and immediately recognized Ethan's handwriting. My heart pounded as I unfolded the paper, unsure of what I was about to read. "There's something I need to tell you. I've tried to find the right moment, but the words always get stuck. I hope you'll forgive me for writing this instead of saying it face to face. Dad's been keeping something from you. I don't think it's fair, and I don't think you deserve it. He's been seeing someone else. I overheard a phone call a few months ago while I was home on break. At first I thought it was business, but then I started noticing the way he talked when you weren't around. The hushed tones, the way he'd suddenly get off the call if you came near. I debated telling you for weeks. I didn't want to hurt you, but I couldn't keep it to myself anymore, especially after the way he's been treating you. You deserve to know the truth, even if it's hard to hear. Please don't let this break you. You're stronger than you realize, and you deserve so much more than this." The letter fell from my hands, and I sank onto the couch, my mind racing. Greg. Cheating. The idea seemed absurd, and Yet the more I thought about it, the more the signs added up. The late nights at the office, the extended business trips, the emotional distance. Anger and betrayal surged through me, mingling with the guilt I'd been carrying since Ethan left. My own indiscretion, fleeting as it had been, felt less damning in the shadow of Greg's betrayal. That evening, I couldn't keep the truth inside. As Greg sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open in front of him, I placed the letter down beside him. "What's this?" he asked, glancing up at me. "Something you should read," I said, my voice trembling. He picked up the letter and scanned its contents. His face went pale, and his jaw tightened. When he finished, he set it down carefully, his hands shaking slightly. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice low. "That's not the point," I said, crossing my arms. "Is it true?" Greg looked away, his silence speaking volumes. "How long has it been going on?" I demanded, my voice rising. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "A few months," he admitted. "It's not what you think." "Not what I think?" I laughed bitterly. "What part of you cheating on me is open to interpretation?" "It wasn't supposed to happen," he said, his tone defensive. "We were having problems, and I felt, I don't know, unseen, unappreciated." I stared at him, incredulous. "You felt unseen? Do you have any idea how I've been feeling for years? You were gone all the time, emotionally checked out, and I just accepted it. I stayed loyal to you." Greg flinched at my words but said nothing. His silence only fueled my anger. "Was it worth it?" I asked. "Throwing away everything we've built for some fling?" "It wasn't like that," he said, his voice breaking. "It wasn't about her. It was about me, about feeling like I mattered." The irony of his words was almost too much to bear. For years, I'd felt like a ghost in my own marriage, desperate for connection, for affection, and now he was trying to justify his betrayal by claiming the same. "Maybe I can't do this," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I can't keep pretending everything's okay." "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice laced with panic. "I'm saying it's over," I said, tears streaming down my face. "We're over." The decision to leave Greg wasn't easy, but it felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I moved into a small apartment across town, taking only what I needed to start fresh. A few weeks later, I received an unexpected text. It was from Ethan. "I'm sorry if I made things harder for you, but I hope you're okay. I'm here if you need anything." His words brought a mix of emotions: gratitude, longing, and a bittersweet ache. I wanted to respond, but I wasn't ready. Not yet. For now, I needed to focus on rebuilding myself, on rediscovering who I was outside of my marriage and the chaos it had brought. But I couldn't deny that Ethan's words, his presence, had been the catalyst for this change. And deep down, I knew our story wasn't finished. Not yet. It had been months since Ethan left, and the void he left behind seemed to echo louder with each passing day. I tried to rebuild myself, pouring my energy into creating a new version of my life. I redecorated my apartment, filled my calendar with social events, and even took up painting, a hobby I hadn't touched since before I met Greg. Yet, in the quiet moments, my thoughts always wandered back to Ethan. His letter, folded and worn from the countless times I'd read it, remained in the drawer of my bedside table, a silent reminder of all the things left unsaid. Then, one day, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I hesitated, debating whether to answer, but something compelled me to pick up. "Hello?" I said tentatively. There was a pause before a familiar voice filled the line. Hi, it's Ethan. My heart leapt, a mix of relief and anxiety flooding me. Ethan? I breathed, gripping the phone tighter. How are you? I'm okay, he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. I've been thinking about you, about everything, and I was wondering if we could talk. The vulnerability in his tone disarmed me. Of course, I replied, my voice softer than I intended. When? I'm in town, he said. Could I stop by tonight? The idea of seeing him again was both thrilling and terrifying, but I knew, deep down, that this conversation was long overdue. Yes, I said, come over. The hours leading up to his arrival passed in a haze of nervous anticipation. When the knock on my door finally came, I took a deep breath before opening it. Ethan stood there, looking both familiar and different. His hair was a little longer, and his eyes held a maturity that hadn't been there before. He gave me a tentative smile. Hi, I said, stepping aside to let him in. We sat across from each other in the living room, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Ethan broke it. I've been replaying everything in my head, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. What happened, what I said, what you said. I've tried to make sense of it all, and I realize I never gave you the apology you deserve. Apology? I asked, surprised. For putting you in that position, he said, leaning forward. For making things more complicated than they already were. I wasn't fair to you, and I hate that I might have made your life harder. His words stirred something deep within me. Ethan, you don't need to apologize, I said. If anything, I should be the one apologizing. I crossed a line too, and I didn't handle things the way I should have. But it wasn't just about what happened, he said earnestly. It was about how I felt, how I still feel. My breath caught at his words. Ethan? I know, he said quickly, his tone softening. I know it can't happen, and I've accepted that, but I couldn't leave things the way they were. I needed to see you, to tell you that I don't regret feeling the way I did. You made me realize so much about myself, about what I want, about what love is supposed to feel like. Tears welled in my eyes, and I looked away, unsure of how to respond. You taught me something too, I said finally. You made me realize how much of myself I'd lost over the years, how long I'd been settling for a life that didn't make me happy. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our shared confessions hanging in the air. Finally, Ethan reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was warm, grounding. I didn't come here to complicate things again, he said. I came here to make peace. With you, with everything. I needed you to know that I'm okay. And I hope you are too. His sincerity brought fresh tears to my eyes. I am, I said, my voice trembling. Or at least I'm getting there. But seeing you, it's brought me more peace than I thought was possible. A small smile tugged at his lips. Good. That's all I wanted. We talked for hours that night, sharing stories, memories, and pieces of ourselves we hadn't been ready to share before. It felt like a weight had been lifted, like we were finally free to move forward without the shadows of what had happened hanging over us. As the night wore on, Ethan stood to leave. I should go, he said, though his reluctance was clear. I walked him to the door, the moment feeling both final and hopeful. Thank you, I said, my voice soft, for coming back, for everything. He smiled, his eyes warm. "Take care of yourself," he said, "and don't forget, you deserve to be happy." Before I could respond, he leaned down and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to my forehead. It was a gesture of comfort, of closure, and of all the love we couldn't express any other way. "Goodbye, Ethan," I whispered as he stepped out into the night. "Goodbye," he said, his voice filled with emotion. In the months that followed, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't known in years. Ethan's visit had given me the closure I needed, and though part of me would always carry a piece of him, I knew it was time to focus on myself. I threw myself into my painting, finding a joy and purpose I hadn't felt in years. I began to reconnect with old friends, to laugh more, to dream again. And slowly, I began to build a life that felt like mine, not one shaped by anyone else, but one that was wholly and authentically me. Ethan's words stayed with me, a quiet reminder of the lesson he had taught me. I did deserve to be happy, and for the first time in a long time, I believed it.